even more amazing is that you'd think that the public in general, especially all the people who just got, laid off of their jobs and, basically fired and will never come back. You think that those people would be getting just a bit ticked off about the fact that the Dow Jones goes up every day. And yet, there's very little public expression of that. I mean, it took the death of a black man in Minneapolis in a particularly ugly way to stimulate a certain kind of uproar in America. But you'd think that some kind of uproar would be stimulated by this divergence between the unreality of the stock market and the harsh reality of people losing their incomes, their jobs, and their futures. And yet it's not present.
Welcome. I'm Chris Martinson, and this is Peak Prosperity.
Hello, everyone. This is Chris Martinson of Peak Prosperity here with another podcast for you. Today, we're going to be talking with James Howard Kunstler, and we are going to be discussing this very timely, very relevant book. We got Living in the Long Emergency, Global Crisis, the Failure of the Futurists and the Early Adapters Who Are Showing Us the Way Forward. It's more relevant than ever. And we're going to be discussing current events, of which there are many, because we're recording this here on the morning of, I guess it's June 1st today. And we had just a weekend of riots in the United States. So Jim, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Chris.
All right. Well, I see we get a secret peek into your bunker, your
my man
lair.
cave. Yeah, it's I'm in a basement office, but it's got a walkout to the back of the house, and there are a lot of fruit trees out there, and the chickens are out there. So, it's not completely a cave, but it's probably not the ideal office. It seems to me every office I've ever had has been less than the ideal office, but I somehow managed to crank it out anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think my probably most productive but least impressive office was the tent I wrote the crash course in up in Maine one summer.
Dang.
I had a little driftwood table I nailed together literally, and kept my laptop charged up on a little solar panel, and that, for a writer, I don't know. You don't need much.
Well, I wrote a book called The City in Mind once on one of those palm top computers where, it was like you have to type like this.
Yeah.
In an Adirondack cabin without electricity in the rain.
So there it is.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that mode of composition.
Yeah. Well, let's pick up right now to what's going on in the world and COVID. How have you been managing the whole pandemic so far? What's been going on for you?
Well, I've been managing it, first of all, by not getting sick. Knock on wood. I'm not really sure. I must confess, I find a lot of the information that comes by me to be pretty confounding and confusing. I have been listening to your broadcasts about it, and I understand the science pretty much, but I live in such a remote part of the country. Well, you kind of do too now, but I'm in flyover land, and you don't hear much, see much about it, and it's a little bit of a remote monster, actually. Mm-hmm. So that's how I feel about it, despite the fact that I know that people are getting it who are not necessarily in nursing homes, and that it's bad news. I'm not sure where we go with this next, though, because I suppose the next stop is that we'll have all these people breaking the lockdown and going out and doing normal things and doing abnormal things like rioting. And 2 weeks from now, we're liable to see a bit of an uptick in the disease, I think. Would you?
Yeah, and if we don't, it's going to mean that this disease is somehow come and gone in some mysterious way.
Yeah.
Barring that.
I see weird news items to the effect. I think there was one that came out of Europe the other day that suggested in Italy that the disease was mysteriously losing its potency. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's another one of those things like, do you really believe it or what,
Well,
And
we'll find out a lot, because I think there were just something ridiculous, like 9,000 people in Colorado all lying down and saying, "I can't breathe," all right near each other. And so the things that we've learned, thanks to several churches, is singing, shouting. Those are the sorts of things that really spread this thing. So
yeah.
I would imagine these protests would have been a really strong chance for this thing to spread. If it doesn't, maybe the Italians are right. Maybe it has sort of mysteriously gotten less potent somehow.
Yeah, but it certainly, I think the larger point is that it has certainly caused an epic disruption in the world economy and in the U.S. economy in particular. I think you and I might agree that a lot of this disorder was sitting there just waiting to be understood, discovered, and made manifest, shall we say.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was already going on in the bond markets, or at least in the overnight loan markets between the big banks back in September. So, the disorder there was really pretty rough. And 6 months later, all of a sudden, we're in coronavirus, and then the markets really start to go crazy. But the banking system is just in such an artificial matrix of its own that it's hard to understand how the thing even works. Like, we're talking on Monday morning after a weekend of rioting, and all the stock indexes are up at the
Yeah.
open.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, it must have been a lot of good news over the weekend, right?
Yeah.
Somebody must have discovered a new a new 9-volt battery that lasts for 1,000,000 years.
I know. I've been highly critical because I don't necessarily want to play the blame game, but let's be clear about this. The Federal Reserve is the headwaters of the Nile in this particular story. They are doing what they feel they have to do in an emergency to rescue markets, because something bad will happen if the markets aren't rescued. But let's be clear, they've been in an emergency for 12 years now. They've been rescuing markets on an almost daily basis because this unnebulous bad thing will happen. And then at the end of that, Jerome Powell has the audacity to come out with a big, interview in Bloomberg and say, "We're not responsible at all for any of the wealth gap that might have happened." And they're 100% responsible.
Yeah, I know,
right?
it's hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
they're pumping a fire hose into Citibank and Goldman Sachs and all the rest of the gang, and
yeah,
they can't understand why. Gee, did that make the stocks go up? Gosh, how'd that happen? But of course, the whole thing is, it's absolutely, utterly deforming the meaning of what capital is. Capital being in the probably the profoundest sense, the what you've acquired from a great expenditure of energy and work and to produce something of value. But when capital is merely dollars that come out of a fire hose that are plugged into a wall somewhere where there's a money making machine, then what is capital really? So they're not, they haven't destroyed capitalism. They've destroyed capital. That's the thing. That's the part that I find so amusing, especially with, the young radicals and the Antifas and the Democratic left. And by the way, I'm still a registered Democrat, even though I'm on the wrong side of the tent now, but somehow sheer inertia, I haven't changed registrations to independent, but the Democrats and the Antifas all think that capitalism is to blame. And it's much more a matter of, capital itself has been buggered. Yep. Not the ism that goes along with it, not the idea. I mean, there's always going to be people who have more something than other people. And that will be, you call that surplus wealth, right? And that's what capitalism is, just managing the surplus wealth. It's not, it's not a belief system and it's not a religion. But when you destroy the nature of capital itself, then it's awfully hard to manage, something that has become really just notional surplus wealth and not real surplus wealth. And that's kind of what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
The moment I'm waiting for is for, I'm sorry to just run over you here, but the moment I'm waiting for is for the people who really are mega wealthy to discover that their wealth isn't there. So that'll be an amusing moment.
Well, I want to talk about this capital idea because, right now, Twitter sphere is this. It's just like this emotional Rorschach test. Some people are calling for more police, brutality and authoritarianism, and other people are aghast to find out it actually exists. And I'm wondering where they've been all these years. But really, this isn't. Yes, there was this super callous display where this cop, knowing that he was being filmed with this smug look on his face, squeezes the life out of George Floyd, right? And the other three cops are just standing around. But it was that level of smugness. They were certain nothing could happen to them. They could do whatever they wanted. There was that impunity, right? And so we're seeing lots of that come up. But this whole thing, I want to talk about, this is the noise. And yes, there's some issues with police militarization and occupying force tactics and all that other bad stuff. But let's back up. We're talking about the Federal Reserve and creating the wealth gap. That's one of these things. But there have been rackets everywhere. To me, that's where these protests, there's a part of me that's saying, I'm all for the protesting, not the violent, not the looting, not the free shopping spree at Target and all that stuff, but the protest itself, I am in high sympathy for, because, as JFK said, if you make peaceful change impossible, but you make violent revolution inevitable, or something close to that.
Yeah.
And there's been no way to really push back against things like civil asset forfeiture, which is just police theft, no-knock raids where they come in and shoot random people and then nothing happens. There's no accountability. But there was no accountability for all the fraud that happened in 2008 from the big bankers. Zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
The healthcare rackets, the sick care rackets, as I call them, just bleeding people dry, right? On and on and on and on. And so those sorts of things, I don't even know how to begin reforming those, right? Because what would you do? Go out, like Occupy Wall Street and hang out and, try and make your voice heard? All that really happens, as far as I'm concerned, is your cell phone records get swept up into the police apparatus, and that's about the end of it.
Yeah. Well, I think some of these things are truly unreformable, and I don't mean that in a hopeless sense, because I'm not hopeless about it at all. I think what it means is you have to look elsewhere for how that stuff is going to change. And, I think the answer is emergence, which is that, societies are emergent organisms that respond to the circumstances that reality presents at a certain time and moment in time.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that, because in here, this is a kind of a departure from some of the books you've written of late. And here you're going into the responses by a bunch of individuals. So sort of these are their emergent reactions. I've got my own, you have yours. There's people are reacting all over the place to this feeling that there's a big emergency here of some kind. And my reaction has been to figure out if I can grow some of my own food, and other people have different reactions. But basically, one emergent property that sort of jumps out at me in here is this idea that people have said, I'm done with that system. I'm going to go try and create a new system for myself. I'm wondering if that's a fair way to look at that.
Yeah, well, I'll explain to the listeners how I organized that book anyway. It was really a three-part kind of book. The first part, I was trying to account for the things that I said in the 2005 book, The Long Emergency, because, there had been some changes on the scene, including shale oil and the whole crash of 2008 and everything connected to that. And the third part of the book was kind of a glimpse into the future. I'm probably one of those failed futurists that they mentioned in the title. I didn't. That title was not going to be my title. The title that I wrote it under was Now What?
Yeah.
But the publisher said, "Oh, that's not connected to your brand. So we've got to bring your brand into the title, The Long Emergency." So, anyways, the middle of the book, the second part, middle of the book, was a series of interviews with people. Most of them had corresponded with me over the years for one reason or another, and I learned something about them. And they were leading alt lifestyles, and they had made a deliberate choice to drop out and do something different. And so those are the people I wrote about.
Yeah, is that any different from what was going on in the 60s? Are people dropping out for sort of similar reasons, or is there something new afoot here?
Well, I think that it was similar, but not the same because many of the dropouts in the 60s dropped out in groups and gangs, and formed communes and things like, these group endeavors. And really, all the people that I have written about are people who, in one way or another, individually went out and carved a niche for themselves in a world that was changing rather drastically, and which most normal Americans had not noticed was changing. Because normal American life is going on, and people are going to the hair salon, and people are doing this job and going to the Target store, and you know working in their cubicle for the Old Navy corporation, or whatever they were doing. They didn't notice that the world was really kind of pregnant with change, but these people did notice. So some of them are back to the landers, and some of them are not, and some of them are highly are ideologues, and some of them are just totally practical people. But they all have one thing in common. They're all pretty brave. They all sort of seize the moment to work out their own version of reality, and work with it, and see if they could make a place for themselves in this world, in a world that is becoming kind of spooky and uncertain, and creating a lot of anxiety for people. And now, of course, you've got a whole nation living in a state of accelerated anxiety, because they don't have any livelihood anymore. Their businesses are going down the tubes. They have no income. They can't pay their bills. And from there, we can only imagine the daisy chain of economic destruction that comes off of that. So these people, I think they're carrying on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really troubling time, because the way I look at it, our national narrative is shredding. It just doesn't make sense anymore. So the words we tell ourselves and our actions, they're just not even aligning even slightly anymore. And so one example of that might be all of the hand-wringing in the political class about how, we have to have a stimulus bill, and we have to support people, and people need to be able to put food on their table. But when you get down to the actions, what I see is really slow, really late, really meager $1,200 stimulus checks that, for whatever reason, this proving to be very hard to get them in the hands of people in a timely way. Hundreds of billions went to major corporations just like that.
Yeah.
Small corporations were allowed to take out loans under very sort of nebulous terms, where the banks had to set a lot of conditions. And if you only had a pre-established relationship, they might get you some, and then you might have to pay it back and all that stuff. Major corporations got bailouts, right? So it's clear that the leaders, I hate to use that, I call them the managers now. And, the managers of the country, they're really only serving the elites and the mega corporations, and everybody else can just go pound sand. That's how it appears to me based on actions.
Yeah, and it's so transparent that they can't even hide it anymore. But you really have to admire their gall, and you really have to be mystified that even the media, the New York Times, nobody picks up on that, and nobody is really reporting on that. I don't think it's because they're afraid of being labeled communists or anything. They just seem to be too dense to get it.
You think
so? That's all mystifying.
How can they be that dense? Come on.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course, but it's barely in the public discussion. I mean, even in the non-mainstream media, people are hardly really squaring that circle. So I think the bottom line may be this, that you and I may be all observers in maybe a Heisenbergian sense of physics. We're failing to notice something about what's going on, and that is that the mere observation of all of this turmoil is making people so crazy that they're having trouble observing the turmoil.
Yeah.
I do think that the country is getting really literally crazy.
Yeah. Well, you've been tracking one brand of that crazy for a while, and that's the whole Russiagate thing. And that giant, and I was I don't watch CNN, but I somehow stumbled across a clip And there was Wolf Blitzer talking with Susan Rice today about how this was Russia stirring up all this trouble. And I just
Yeah,
like,
they can't let it go.
that horse
know?
is so dead that it's literally a rug at this point in time, and
Yeah.
they're just flailing away at it. And I'm just like, oh,
It,
please.
it reminds me of like, a dog that I used to have who had this particular chewy toy that, it started out looking like, a chocolate soldier. And after 3 years of being chomped on, you couldn't tell whether it was a giant amoeba or a pork chop or what. And that's what Russiagate's getting to be now, kind of just an all-purpose pork chop that the, chewy toy that the left is chewing on. I think they're kind of, look, all this stuff is now being eclipsed by the extreme disorder that the country is falling into all of a sudden.
Mhm.
I mean, the COVID-19 thing, for all practical purposes, that's still all of a sudden. Russiagate's been going on for 3 years, but it is coming to a head, and it is looking like it is looking like some people might be indicted. And the amount of information that's just come out in the last 4 weeks is pretty staggering about the failure of the law enforcement authorities at the federal level that can't make people feel good about the credibility of the government per se. And really, that may be what's at stake finally with Russiagate, is that, they're afraid for the public to understand how untrustworthy they've become.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if it's the way I understand it, it's a really dangerous precedent, because it means there's an arm of the government that's not elected, that's out of control, that's
Yeah.
busy doing whatever it wants to do, including creating control files on people and tapping their phones. If that's, you can even use that term anymore. They're sweeping all the communications up around individuals, and it's Orwellian. It's a surveillance state that's decided it knows what it wants. But when you peel back the layers, it always seems that what it wants is more power and more money for these really unsavory characters who are sort of lurking in the shadows there. There are people who I realize that, Jim, that I would not enjoy being around, wouldn't want them as friends, and they just look like psychopaths to me. It's all power and money. It's just pure Machiavellian junk. And there's no grander vision of protecting democracy or keeping our nation safe or doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Yeah.
It just looks like power hungry individuals who want more money. And
Yeah, and now it's power hungry individuals who want more money, who are working day and night to protect their reputations and keep themselves out of jail. So, that's another level of the story.
yeah.
But imagine what bad optics that's going to be when half a dozen former top government officials are marched into a grand jury. And it's not the kind. The system's pretty fragile. It'll it's not going to be a death blow to the system, but it's just going to be another one of those 1,000 cuts that is taking us to a new a new chapter of American history and economy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, something that you and I both have done for a long time now is talk about peak oil. And to me, peak oil is the large, grand organizing story. If you understand that, you can fit a lot of things under there, and really the rest is details, because we're an organism. We need energy. Energy animates everything. If you start to see energy in your life, it's kind of like that moment in the movie The Matrix where Neo finally can see the Matrix. He sees all the green things in the hallway there. Once you see energy, you see every truck, every car, every plane, every ship, every boat, every calorie you eat, all come from this fossil fuel energy that we're pulling in. And I thought the peak oil was going to hit a lot earlier. Than this shale oil thing came along. And honestly, it gets a little detail oriented for people, but
Yeah.
the simple thing is the old oil was really high net energy. This new stuff, it really isn't. It's very difficult to get, and we might get 5 barrels back for 1 barrel of input, where it used to be 100 to 1. And so it's kind of like we're trying to climb a mountain now, whereas before we were eating Snickers bars, and now we've got celery, right?
Yeah.
It's just we're not going to go as we might not summit this one, but I don't think people are really still aware of that. I think it's going to come roaring back at some point. I'm just wondering, in here you wrote about the whole shale piece pretty extensively. Shale just got clobbered by the corona and the drop in oil prices. What do you see in there, and how do you fit that larger story into your thinking now?
Well, I call the shale oil miracle a stunt.
Yep.
Quote, miracle. It was a financial stunt, and it was a magnificent stunt in many ways, as many American stunts are, putting men on the moon, etc. But it was a stunt, and we were producing just under 5 million barrels a day around 2008, when and that started to cause disfigurements in the economy. And we kind of pulled ourselves out of that with debt, right? And that's been a big part of your story.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that whole debt matrix was the money that was lent to the shale oil producers to get that shale oil out of the ground in a very complex, highly technological method that they used. So they finally jacked up the production to 13 million barrels a day, which was 3 million past 1970 peak of around 10 million barrels a day. And it was a magnificent stunt to get U.S. oil production up that far. The problem is that they did it all with borrowed money, and much of it, the kind of borrowed money that is kind of janky and covenant light loans and all kinds of strange lending, junk bond lending, and they spent 10 years producing all this oil and getting to a new peak and demonstrating that they couldn't make a red cent producing that shale oil. So now they're at a point, having done that, having accomplished that stunt, where all of a sudden we're in the middle of a financial calamity and capital itself is disappearing, including the capital that they would require to continue their operations. And having proved that they can't make money at it, they're not going to get more loans, which means they're not going to continue their operations, at least not nearly at the level that they were, which means that magnificent figure of 13 million barrels a day is going to come down probably as swiftly as it went up, maybe even faster. And so, I think that the bottom line is that shale oil is going to prove a huge disappointment to the public, and not just a psychological disappointment, but it'll be a real fiasco economically, because we'll be back where we started again, where we have this enormous infrastructure for daily life that running at full tilt requires 20 million barrels a day of oil, and we can't supply it. And even though shale oil has come along, we still have been importing millions of barrels of oil a day. So it's a fraud that we're energy independent. So that whole thing is, unfortunately, that could be as devastating to whatever remains of the economy as the COVID-19 virus, because it'll be hugely destabilizing when we start to see our production going down fast. And there's this valence between production and consumption, and that changes constantly, and the moving parts of it change constantly. And as the production goes down, we'll also be seeing the phenomenon of demand going way down as people go broke. And so that's going to have the strange effect, possibly, of keeping oil prices relatively low, even as it's becoming scarcer. So, that's a big part of the problem. Another part of the problem, which is, it's still a problem, but not quite as bad as the financing thing, is the fact that shale oil is a certain kind of extra super light oil that doesn't have a lot of the petroleum fractions that we need, like diesel and aviation fuel. And but are we even going to have the amount of aviation that we had 6 months ago? That's not looking like it's going to come back, anytime soon at the level that it did. And I would have to conclude, as a general thing, that nothing in our everyday life that we knew, 6 months ago, a year ago, is going to come back to the same scale that it was operating at before. So then, the next question is, okay, then what's the next level that we're going down to, and can we even stay at that level, or are we going to stair step down further?
Hmm. And why is that you think things won't come back to the levels they used to be at?
Well, because we're not going to have the energy mojo to do it. If we don't, if we're not producing that much oil, even if it's not great oil, if we're only producing 5 million barrels a day, and other parts of the country, other parts of the world, their production is going down too. We are going to truly finally be in that peak oil situation. Of course, there are all these fantasies that we're going to run Walmart and the U.S. military and Walt Disney World and the interstate highway system on alternative energy. But that's a fantasy too, because all of those things, all the wind and the solar, apart from the fact that it only produces fractionally the amount of energy that we need, it all really basically depends on having a support system of an oil economy to even allow you to fabricate the hardware to do it, make the solar cells and make the windmills and the turbines. So, we're in a bad spot. And considering that there are an awful lot of smart people in this world, we're doing a pretty piss poor job of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. So as you know, from my COVID tracking, I was just using what I consider to be logic and common sense, right? And there were simple things that you could say, which is like, if everybody wears a mask, here's what happens, and so really the key is to stop somebody who's sick, who might be asymptomatic, from spreading particles. Like, how much easier could it be? Oh my gosh, there's still, people confused about that and can't quite wrap their heads around that. So to me, that's a depressing metaphor, because if you can't handle 1 + 1 = 2 logic, what you're talking about is like differential calculus. It's just, it's going to be hard.
It's not easy, but understanding the economy that we've been is not been in is not easy, because it was what it was, largely because it was technical and hyper complex. And, hyper complexity is difficult. So, of course, people didn't understand it. Most people don't even understand how their car works anymore. This was a nation full of people who used to be able to fix their own cars. Yeah. That's absolutely impossible now. So, that's kind of a metaphor for everything else that we've done. We've created so much hyper complexity that, we can barely run our own lives.
Yeah, I was just talking with a farmer who's coaching me in how to maybe farm. And so I have a tractor. I've got this nice Kubota now, it's used, but he asked me the year and he said, that's still post emissions control. He said, sometimes things break. I would really highly recommend you get yourself a 1960s Farmall, because he said your 8-year-old, if you had one, could figure out how to put that carburetor back together. It's like 4 moving parts. It will not break. Yeah. They're still around, and all of that stuff, because here's a guy who's really into farming. He said the new tractor's a wonderful thing, but they break, and they're very hard to fix now.
Yeah, I like to hang out with the tractor guys at the Washington County Fair over here on the New York side. Yeah, because they got exactly that. They got like the 1963 Farmall, and they love those things, because they're so simple. They got these old banger engines. They got like 11 moving parts, not hard to understand. And you're right, my 6-year-old can fix this. So so have you got all kinds of emission control things on that thing, and catalytic converters? And
I don't know. When I bought it, I dutifully lifted the hood, but what am I looking at? I don't know. There's an engine in there.
Have you got like a front end loader on it or something, or anything like that?
I've got a front end loader and some things for the back. And
have you tried using the darn thing?
Oh yeah.
What's it like to run that front end loader? I got to confess, I've never run a front end loader. It looks to me like it would take some experience to do that.
It does take a little finesse, because it's not as easy as like a fully dedicated, bucket loader for like on a Case 580 or something. So you have to come in, and you have to go both be moving forward and scooping and lifting at the same time. There's like there's this whole thing if you want to get a full bucket.
Wow.
And it's not as powerful as you would think. You're not going to just go into like solid earth and like do much to it, but it'll move wood chips, and it'll move manure, and it'll move, piles pretty well. Yeah. But
Did you have you constructed a garden from the ground up now?
yes, yeah, got a nice
Have you
one
got
going.
fencing in?
Yep,
Oh, goody.
yep.
That's like that's the hard part, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I've gotten good at fencing over the years. So,
Yeah, I remember from your old place, you did a really good job with that.
yeah.
Now that you mention it, and also with the grape standards.
Yes, so I started over. So I have 11 grape plants that are this tall, and
Oh, yay.
yeah. So 3 years from now, talk to me. We'll be,
Are you going to make enough for a grape soda?
I hope so. Not this year though. Um,
Okay.
so, but yeah, no, it's just, I'm in first yearitis. We're busily trying to figure out how to get animals, and I have to lime the fields because this local farmer was basically strip mining it. Every time you take a load of hay off, you're taking nutrients away,
Hmm.
and he didn't put anything back on. So the
Hmm.
fields look weak, and I've got to do a lot to get them back into shape. So I'm learning as fast as I can. And I'm doing this for the same reason I think you have the people telling their stories in here, which is
Yeah.
I have this sense, Jim, that food is going to be harder to come by, and
Yeah.
that this cataclysmic sort of shock that 40 million people out of work and the ending of a 50-year delusion that we can always just borrow more and everything will work out, the shattering of all that, I think I can't predict what's going to happen, but I have this strong sense that I want to know where a little bit more of my food is actually coming from.
Hmm.
That's been my response to this so far.
Yeah. Well, I think you're well positioned for that, and I also think that this period that's coming up over the next 10 years is going to be probably regarded as a really a transitional period in human history, where people were hugely confused about what was going on, and some people made good choices, and a lot of people were unable to act. They were kind of frozen and paralyzed, and uh, you know, I think that there will be kind of uh, a monastic kind of quality to the places that are doing things correctly, and people they will really be lifeboats.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wrote a year ago an article that's now highly prescient where I said there was going to be this extraordinary back to the land movement where people who are living in cities are going to start to figure out those weren't the right places to be. And now with
Hmm.
COVID plus the riots, I just see this as like absolutely on steroids. Everybody who can and can afford to, I think, is going to start ditching out of the big
It
cities.
hugely is accelerating a problem that was waiting to happen, which was that the cities had become overscaled, especially in terms of the resource realities of the future and the capital realities. And now those capital realities are really biting, because in a place like New York, I had a conversation with my literary agent about a week ago. He's actually just bugging out of Manhattan
Mhm.
and, moving to Cape Cod. I mean, who does that if you're a New York literary agent? But he said 60% of the people in the Upper East Side were not there anymore. What does that mean? Well, what it means to me is if a lot of them don't come back, or if a lot of them stick around their summer houses and don't come back,
Mhm.
you know, um, there goes the New York tax base. It's all, even at the height of financialization of the economy, uh, they were still struggling to maintain the subway and pay for the infrastructure and pay for the social services.
Yeah.
But if all of that wealth leaves New York, that's basically the end of the financialization of New York's economy and of cities in general. Their tax bases are going to crash. They won't be able to fix anything, and they'll find themselves in a downward spiral of disinvestment and decrepitation, and people aren't going to stick around.
Well,
And you,
no, that's easy. Just all they have to do is raise taxes.
yeah, right. Well, raise taxes on people who aren't there. I
Right.
don't think they're going to be able to do that.
But you raise taxes and then more people leave, so you raise taxes. That's called Chicago, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Chicago, meanwhile, yeah. I mean, the riots this week were not exactly comedy or anything, but you had to laugh. That they were deploring the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and meanwhile, like, I don't know, 35 people got shot on Memorial Day weekend in Chicago.
Which, yeah, pretty typical weekend though, right?
Yeah, well, it was actually pretty, pretty good body count for a weekend in Chicago. But it's generally pretty up in the double digits at least.
Yeah, and interestingly, Chicago, a state and a place which has some of, and if not the strictest gun laws in the country, um,
Yeah, well,
showing that the laws make you feel good, but they don't do much, right? In the scheme of things.
yeah, I guess anybody who really wants to get a piece in Chicago can go out and get a piece.
Right. So back to this idea though, that
Yeah,
the economy is not going to achieve its old heights.
yeah,
One common motif is from people I know is that some of them were in these jobs, they didn't really like them, they get laid off and or they spend a couple of months home and the cobwebs clear and they go, I don't want to go back to that. I
yeah.
feel this change in myself where it's going to take a lot to get me back on a plane, let alone a cruise ship, let alone in any sort of large gatherings, for a while. COVID would have to go away for a while. I think there's a lot of people, let's even if it's 20%, not 100, but some number. I think people have made shifts, just like the Great Depression shifted my grandmother and grandfather forever, right? They saved strings off of roasts, for later use.
Was that the
Um,
one who was a banker?
no, the other side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I think this COVID is going to leave indelible impressions, including I think it's really broken the spell of, for a lot of people, I got to be in the rat race. I've got to just take out debt. I got to buy a new car. I got to, all that whole consumptive thing. I think that spell's been broken for enough people. I don't think it's coming back to its old heights, if you can call it that. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think you're right, although it's a little bit hard to see exactly how large numbers of people will get to that, considering that, they're in circumstances that really oblige them to come up with some kind of a nut every month for things that they are basically contracted to do, like pay a mortgage or make a car payment or pay the lease on a car or, you know, all the other obligations that we have. I don't know how people are going to get out of that, but at the same time, I can't see how the whole system of time payments on all things can remain stable. So many people are going to be defaulting on their mortgages and car payments that the whole system is going to not work. So, it's a question of, you want to get out of that life, and how disorderly is the system going to be while you're trying to get out of it? And then
Well,
what are your obligations to that system? You still owe $230,000 on a $600,000 house that you've been paying down for X numbers of years. uh and and you're underwater now because the real estate market is uh in trouble. How
yep.
are you going to get out of that obligation? So, and there probably are ways to do it. So maybe I don't know. You've really been on a course for the last 15, 20 years that was a very deliberate set of choices that you made with a certain body of knowledge that you had. And, I followed a similar kind of path. And a lot of people are coming into this at the 11th hour.
Mm-hmm.
And they waited until the world became very disorderly to decide, maybe I didn't want to be part of that racket. I think it's going to be hard for all of them. And, whenever you're in a difficult state of flux like this, it generates a lot of friction and a lot of heat and light and conflict and trouble. So, there's probably going to be a lot of hardship involved in this for people, even the people with the best intentions of, bailing out and doing something different. Don't you think?
Well, I do think, and I'm finding myself battling critics right now in my head, which, there are all these people saying, give the Cassandra thing. Oh, you've been cheering this on. And I've been working, to be clear, Jim, I've been working really hard to try and prevent this from happening. And I
Mhm.
thought over the years, if I could just shame the Federal Reserve into, not being the way they are, but they're unshameable, right? They literally have no, I mean, they have to be psychopaths or sociopaths that, I mean, they literally don't care that their policies are fostering the largest wealth gap ever. And as Plutarch said, that's the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics, because that creates this disharmony. And who wants to live in that world of a few ultra elites and a lot of very desperate people? I mean, it's arguably an awful direction to go in, but they didn't care because that's what they're doing, right? And it benefited them or whatever their internal rationalizations are. But I do think this gets very hard, except I'll put one little piece in. I think for people who are willing to go through a rapid adjustment reaction and understand the world's different, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that old world's coming back for a whole lot of reasons. I don't want it to come back for a whole lot of reasons. But to get to that new world, you got to let go of the old one, right? I know that's hard because I did it and you've done it and a lot of people are doing it. But that would be my advice to people is you got to find a way to let go of what was and see what's coming. Because I actually, the optimist in me says it's hard for a while, but there's actually a better future out there if we do it right. There's a worse one if we do it wrong. So I'm still in the fight and fighting that fight. But,
I feel the same way about my little town. I live in a flyover town that's a former factory village that had like 5 factories that made textiles and paper and stuff back in the day. And, it's the bones of the village are there, but none of the activities are still there. And, it's just another pathetic American flyover town. But, I see so much opportunity, especially now that, there's certain conditions that are coming, that are manifesting. One is that the cities are obviously entering a state of failure and people are going to have to find another place to go. And the suburbs may not really be a great option, right? So they're going to need that. And we're going to probably encounter problems with food and feeding all the people in the United States. And that means that if you happen to be in an agricultural backwater, as I am, a place that has provided a lot of food in the past and has a lot of farming terrain, and also has, some decent water power and things like that, I can see a place like this coming back. But, they've got to sweep away the things that are now sustaining it, like the strip mall at the edge of town, which is where all the commerce migrated to from the main street. And, I think a lot of people will be very sorry to see all that stuff go. They were very sorry to see the Kmart go when it closed down in March of 2018. And it was a great shock to the town because it was really, the only general merchandise store within 20 miles, right? But they were sorry to see it go, and nobody opened a general merchandise store in the downtown. But now, I can see a situation where a lot of these chain stores are going to be swept away all over America, and they're not going to be replaced by other chain stores. Somebody's going to have to do something to distribute stuff in America. We're probably going to have some stuff. We might not have a choice of 106 different kinds of broom, right? But we'll probably have 1 or 2 or 3 kinds, something like that. Who's going to sell them? And, young people out there might be asking themselves, well, geez, maybe I could sell brooms and dustpans, and maybe I could find somebody who can maybe manufacture one, and, maybe we'll have to make it out of metal instead of plastic, or make it out of something else, wood, who knows, but we'll do it. And, the way that this economy is going to be reorganizing itself is going to be strange and shocking, I think, as we go along. And I think we're just going to be in for one shock after another. Oh, it'll be like, oh, that's what you do when this thing fails. This is what you do when personal transportation is no longer possible for 87% of the population, because they can no longer get a loan to buy a car, and General Motors has gone out of business because they can't keep going if they're only selling 860,000 units a year instead of 4 million. So, awful lot of changes out there.
Yeah, well, as you said in chapter 11, you called it other nagging details.
Oh yeah,
like the food question, right?
Yeah.
And so
I just won't eat for a month, I guess.
Glad I got some stored up here. So I've been shocked watching, not shocked, but just the disconnect on display as the Federal Reserve has been doing everything in its power to just jam stock prices up and buy junk debt. And so junk bond prices are going up, all this stuff that's buying mortgage-backed securities. So they're paying more than they are actually worth, and all of that, knowing that they're going to foist those eventual losses off onto the taxpayer. and all of that is just grotesque to me because I mean, look at the symbolism behind that, which is saying we're going to make stocks go up, even though the trade deal just fell apart with China. We're in really bad geopolitical tensions with China. We're basically bumping uglies with them in the South China Sea with naval assets. We got all kinds of tension there. We've got a 40% decline in first quarter GDP, probably maybe according to or second quarter GDP according to the Federal Reserve Atlanta base. We've got 40 million people out of work. We've got like all of these awful things happening, and the response has been, well, let's see if we can make Google's stock price go up a little higher today. Right?
Yeah.
And that's just, it's unseemly, but it's a caricature of what leadership ought to be. It's just bad management, right? It's like, I think they're just that out of ideas. That's how I interpret this. Like, they're that out of ideas that their only response right now is to paint some veneer or shellac on this, and they do that by painting the tape, painting the numbers.
Yeah, it's a kind of feckless, the kind of feckless behavior that you see with, just about every elite in some kind of a wobbling empire or wobbling, civilization that's come along. They develop a strange kind of short-sighted fecklessness that is amazing. But what's even more amazing is that you'd think that the public in general, especially all the people who just got laid off of their jobs and basically fired and will never come back, you think that those people would be getting just a bit ticked off about the fact that the Dow Jones goes up every day, and yet there's very little public expression of that. I mean, it took the death of a black man in Minneapolis in a particularly ugly way to stimulate a certain kind of uproar in America. But you'd think that some kind of uproar would be stimulated by this divergence between the unreality of the stock market and the harsh reality of people losing their incomes, their jobs, and their futures. And yet it's not present. It's not. And you're right. The shamelessness of it is just staggering. You'd think that Jay Powell would try to make the stock market go down for 3 days in a row, just so that people, wouldn't get the idea that it only goes up. So, but I also think you can make arguments that it's not going to go up forever, and that there will be some kind of a reckoning over that. And the time will come when the hedge funders and the employees of BlackRock Finance and the K Street lobbyists they're going to wake up some morning and find out that they're not as wealthy as they thought they were.
Yeah, and to rewind a bit, the United States is about 4% of the world's population, consuming about 20% of the world's primary energy.
Wow.
And that statistic tells you why the United States has a strong economy. And if that ever reverses or becomes more egalitarian, where the United States is consuming a more proportional percentage basis,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is coming.
Sure.
And by the way, futurist time, could get this wrong, but the stunning lack of investment in oil right now, the collapse of investment in shale, but nothing's
Mm-hmm.
happening in deep water. That requires $80 to $100 barrel oil to prosecute. Nothing's happening. And fields are being damaged as they're being shut down willy-nilly and overpumped. Like, it's just crazy time, right? It's not how an intelligent species would be managing its prime asset at this point in time, knowing it's finite, it runs out someday. We
Mm-hmm.
only have so much time to use it to navigate to that different future. We're just sort of thrashing about. Like I said, like I can't do the masks, we're probably not going to get that one right. So as I watch that, my prediction is the United States has a collapse in shale production. It comes back slowly and grudgingly, and only at higher prices. And by the time that all sort of begins to sort itself out and pick itself up, there's actually an oil shortage in the world
Mm-hmm.
due to this lack of investment. And then we see trillions of central bank printing and a relative shortage of oil. And then we see the last stage of this story, which is a magnificent explosion in what we would call inflation, but it's actually too much money and too little stuff. But the too little
Mm-hmm.
stuff was for other structural reasons. The oil isn't getting pumped because it wasn't, because
Mm-hmm.
we did it wrong. I see that explosion coming. that to me is the last act in all of this. And I would implore people listening, it would have been good to start 11 years ago. Today is the second best time to plant that tree, right? So I think people still need to get prepared, because this isn't like the nadir of this story. I think there's more to come.
Yeah. And, a lot of people who are going to make these changes in their lives, they're going to come in at an entry level position to a lot of this. People who, for one reason or another, decide, maybe there's a future in food production and farming in some way. They may not go out there and be in a position to buy 40 acres, but they may be able to work for somebody who's got 40 acres and is organizing some kind of a farming enterprise that employs more humans than was formerly the case. Because I do believe that one feature of the future will be that farming will require much more human attention than it does now. We're not going to just have one guy sitting in a $3 million combine, watching Kevin Costner movies while the combine automatically follows the furrows back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be more a matter of, gangs of people working together to do this. One of the things that's impressed me about just going through the archives of the old photographs of my county around here, it's so impressive to see how much work was accomplished by people, by men especially, working in gangs, and women working in groups. And it makes such a difference. I think working alone at something like that is actually pretty demoralizing and discouraging. But when you're there with 20 other people making things happen, you get a lot done. And it's really surprising how much people can get done without a whole lot of super hyper sophisticated machinery. And I think that'll be a feature of it. And people who are leaving Brooklyn, and leaving the high tech rackets to get into something else might consider that.
Yeah, I had the little town in Massachusetts here, and it's notable to me because it's got some old mines, and many of them were in operation well before the Civil War. And I walked by a couple of them. One is a flooded mine shaft that just goes straight down, just up a hiking trail. You can go fall down that flooded mine shaft if you want. But just looking at that and thinking, I looked up the dates on that, and this thing last produced in the late 1800s. So they were dragging, this is up a mountain, right? So horses and teams and barrels of flour and hardtack and maybe some bacon, I don't know. But somehow with whatever iron tools they had and whatever crude dynamite they had, they managed to make a big old shaft in the ground. And the pile of rocks outside of this, the tailing pile, I'm like, I bet every one of those was hauled up with a shoulder and a pulley. Right?
I had the same feeling when I like to kind of spook around the industrial ruins of the area I'm in, and there are a lot of them because this is the convergence of the Battenkill River, which is a major tributary of the Hudson. And there were a lot of hydro sites along the Battenkill, and there were a lot of factories on them, and there are a lot of ruins out there. And you see these mill races that were built in the 1850s. And that's a very difficult task. I mean, imagine you're trying to build a mill race. You've got to keep the mainstream of the river from actually being in the place where you need to do the work, So you got to build something to divert that. And then you got to get all these enormous stones in place, these enormous dressed quarry stones in place. And it just blows my mind that they did that in a time without steam shovels and, powered equipment. They just did it with horses and men and levers and wheels.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that we can do without many of the technological blandishments of modernity, and I think we're going to probably need to learn how to do it.
Well, that's the reskilling, and that's certainly something I think a lot of the people in your book were everybody in here had to go through some sort of reskilling, right? There was some, hey, I used to be an accountant, or I entered data at the IRS, or whatever their story was, and now they're living in a cabin in Alaska, or trying to farm, or figuring out how to grind, wheat and make it into bread. And there's all kinds of stories in there. I think that is the theme here, is this reskilling. And again, my advice to people is, don't wait better start learning that stuff. I've been imploring people to plant a garden. There's just so much learning that goes into gardening, and the earlier you get started on it, the better. And there's really no way to short circuit that process. I am concerned that whatever skills that those people of old had, that they knew how to take a 15-ton dressed quarry stone and move it into position. I don't know how to do that, and I don't know anybody who does,
Yeah. But the skill is there in the ether somewhere to be rediscovered.
Yep, and it can and will be done. So that is my hope in all of this, is that actually a lot of modern life has been demoralizing, and that people will have a chance to re-engage with stuff they find meaningful and purposeful.
Yeah.
And sometimes that looks like hard work.
Well, I was engaging just this month with my compost. I didn't know much about making compost when I started, and I built myself a 3-bay bin, and then I added a 4th bay with a wire bin. And so for the last year, I've been piling all this chicken bedding and chicken manure in with the vegetative stuff, and it all cooked for a year or two. And, I moved it around from one bin to another, and I can't believe how beautiful this compost is.
Nice.
I mean, and to say that this is something that you get a great deal of satisfaction out of is kind of weird, But I look at this golden stuff, this granular golden stuff, which looks better than the best potting soil you could ever find. And, and I'm forking it onto the wheelbarrow, and I'm taking it out and hilling up the potatoes with it. Hope it doesn't kill them. But it's been well cooked.
Yep.
And I just, it provided me with a lot of satisfaction that, this city boy who grew up in the east side of Manhattan, going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art at lunch break every day, because they used to let us out of the school for some mysterious reason, that I'm, developing my composting abilities. So if I can do it, anybody can.
I love hearing that. That's just a great story. And, part of that is you got to be willing to try. You got to be willing to make mistakes. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes over this next year, guaranteed.
Yeah, I made them with the fruit trees. Have you made fruit tree mistakes?
Yeah. I just made another one. It was embarrassing. So I'd planted some that were a little further away from the house than I normally would do these things, and I went out there and I looked and I realized they were water stressed because these were bare roots that I'd put in, and I just it hadn't rained, and I just so I stressed them out pretty hard.
Yeah. Oh wow.
You got to water them a lot when you put bare roots in. So.
Oh yeah. Wow.
Every day. So.
Because I've got a lot of fruit problems, and I'm trying to battle them with neem oil.
That sounds insectivorous. You got something going on there.
I got like brown rot on the plums, and I've got some aphids on the apples, and I got a lot of little things that want to rob me of my fruit.
Yeah, that's everything does. That's just how that is. So, well, listen, I wanted everybody ought to be reading this book right here, Living in the Long Emergency. Mine's an advanced preview copy, so thank you for sending that along.
Yeah, it's just pretty much the same as the published edition.
Yeah, this is available now, right?
Yeah, it's available now. And in fact, it came out, I think, on the very day that the long emergency really started in earnest. Like the official publication date, I think, was March 10th or something.
Yep.
Around the time of like the COVID seclusion orders.
Yep. And of course, you've got your blog, which comes out twice a week now.
Yep.
And people can get to that.
www.kunstler.com, and it comes out on Mondays and Fridays by about 10 minutes after 10 at the latest.
Yeah. And interesting comments, all that's falling under there. So great writing, of course. Check that out as well. And what are you working on now? What's next?
Well, I'm actually writing a book I've been doing it for 2 years, about teenage anxiety and the development of boys into men. And it's called Young Man Blues. And a part of it is kind of a memoir of my own adolescence, and I'm having a good time writing it. I always enjoy writing. I'm not one of these people who's like agonizing over, sitting down at the keyboard. I'm not like drinking myself into a stupor at 3:00 in the afternoon. I don't have a whole lot of obsessive compulsive neuroses that keep me away from the task at hand. I just enjoy producing the paragraphs. Gives me a bang. So and this one does as much as all the others have. So we'll do that. I'm just not, I'm not confident there will be a publishing industry when I finish it, even if it's, a year from now.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's who can be confident of anything at this point in time?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's going to take a year to just see how this all settles out, I'm sure.
I might have to turn it into a song and dance act and do it in the local bistro.
If you turn it into a piece of performance art, I will show up.
All righty.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time today, and really appreciate all the work that you do in the world to help people see how things are actually stacked up.
Always a pleasure to visit with you.